The floorboards lifted away to reveal a warm glow from below, and 17 pairs of eyes stared down into a space that shouldn't exist. Outside, the blizzard screamed at -20 degrees, but 8 feet beneath a Montana cabin, 16-year-old Thomas Harwell had built something that would keep them all alive. Before we go further, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and if survival stories like this one move you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode will leave you speechless. The boy's hands gripped the edge of the floorboard and pulled upward. The hidden hinge system he had installed 18 months earlier worked perfectly, lifting a 3-by-4-foot section of the cabin floor as smoothly as a cabinet door. Warm air rose from the opening, carrying the scent of earth and stone and the faint smell of burning wood. Below, in a space that extended 12 feet by 20 feet and reached 8 feet deep into the Montana soil, lanterns cast steady light across stone walls and wooden shelves stocked with supplies that would sustain life through the storm raging outside. Thomas Harwell was 16 years old on March 2, 1990, when the worst blizzard in 41 years trapped 17 people in his grandfather's cabin. 14 children, 2 teachers, 1 bus driver, and Thomas himself. The storm had arrived with brutal speed, transforming a mild early spring afternoon into a whiteout nightmare in less than 20 minutes. Wind speeds reached 85 miles per hour. Visibility dropped to 0. The temperature plummeted from 45 degrees to -20 in just over 6 hours, with wind chill reaching -70. The school bus had been traveling Highway 12 when the storm hit. The driver had attempted to continue toward town, but within minutes the road disappeared beneath snow and wind. He had managed to navigate 400 yards off the highway toward the only structure visible through the white chaos: Thomas's cabin, its outline barely discernible through the storm. The bus had come to rest in a snowbank 380 yards from the cabin's front door. Thomas had heard the engines straining against the wind. He had pulled on his heaviest coat, tied a rope around his waist, secured the other end to the cabin's porch railing, and walked into conditions that should have killed him. 25 minutes to cover less than 400 yards. He found the bus with its windows beginning to ice over on the interior, children huddled together for warmth, the driver trying to keep the engine running to maintain heat, but knowing they had perhaps an hour before the fuel ran out. The decision had been immediate. Town was 8 miles away through impassable conditions. The cabin was close. Thomas led them back, following his rope through wind that tried to tear them off their feet, through snow that already measured 3 feet deep and was accumulating at a rate of 2 inches per hour. Now they stood in the cabin, 17 people crowded into a space built for 1, and the temperature inside was already dropping. The wood stove struggled against the cold seeping through walls and windows. Thomas looked at the faces around him, saw the fear in the children's eyes, the uncertainty in the adults' expressions, and made the choice his grandfather had prepared him to make. He lifted the floorboards and showed them what he had built. Thomas had been alone in the cabin for 8 months when the blizzard arrived. His grandfather, Jacob Harwell, had died the previous July at age 73. Heart attack while splitting firewood on a Tuesday afternoon. Thomas found him an hour later, the axe still embedded in the log, Jacob's body already cooling in the summer heat. They had been each other's only family since Thomas was 7 years old, when his parents died in a car accident on black ice outside Billings. Jacob had raised the boy in the old cabin he had built himself in 1947, 5 miles from the nearest neighbor, 12 miles from the small town of Garnet Ridge. Population, 342. The cabin sat on 80 acres of rough Montana grassland, bordered by pine forest to the north and open range to the south. Jacob had chosen the location specifically for its isolation and its access to a reliable water table at just 11 feet below the surface. The old man had been what people politely called a survivalist, and what they less politely called paranoid. He kept 6 months of food stored at all times. He maintained a vegetable garden that produced enough to can 40 quarts of vegetables each fall. He taught Thomas to hunt, to trap, to identify edible plants, to read weather patterns, and to understand that civilization was a thin veneer over chaos that could crack at any moment. Most importantly, Jacob taught Thomas about the blizzard of 1949. Montana's worst recorded winter storm had struck in January of that year. Jacob had been 32 years old, living alone in a cabin much like the one Thomas now occupied. The storm lasted 4 days. Temperatures reached -42 degrees. Wind speeds exceeded 70 miles per hour. Snow accumulated to depths of 15 feet in places, with drifts measuring 30 feet or more. 73 people died across Montana during that storm. Hundreds of thousands of cattle and sheep froze or starved. Entire ranches were wiped out financially and literally, buildings crushed under snow weight. Jacob survived because he had prepared. He had food, water, fuel, and most importantly, he had built a root cellar that extended 6 feet underground. The cellar had maintained a temperature of 48 degrees throughout the storm, while the cabin above struggled to stay above freezing, even with the stove burning constantly. Jacob spent portions of each day in that cellar, warming himself from the inside out by sitting against earth that held the summer's heat far better than any wall or stove could generate. He told Thomas this story every winter. Every year, the telling became more detailed, more emphatic. "The ground doesn't freeze if you go deep enough," Jacob would say. "Air temperature doesn't matter when you're surrounded by Earth. Heat from the planet's core, that's constant, that's reliable, that's what saves you when everything else fails." Thomas remembered every word. After Jacob died, those words became an obsession. The original root cellar beneath the cabin measured 4 feet by 6 feet and reached 5 feet deep. Jacob had dug it by hand in 1948, the summer before the Great Blizzard, working in the evenings after finishing his day's work on a neighboring ranch. The cellar had a dirt floor, walls of stacked fieldstone with no mortar, and a wooden ceiling that consisted of rough-cut planks supporting the cabin floor above. Access was through a simple trap door in the cabin's northwest corner, a 2-by-3-foot opening with a hinged plank door. Thomas had been going down into that cellar since he was 8 years old. Jacob stored potatoes, carrots, turnips, and apples there. The temperature remained between 42 and 55 degrees year-round, cool enough to preserve root vegetables through the winter, warm enough that nothing froze even when January temperatures outside reached -30. The space smelled of earth and stone and the slightly sweet scent of stored apples. Jacob talked about expanding the cellar for years, but never did. "If I was younger," he would say, "I'd make this thing twice as big, put in proper supports, stone walls all around, make it a real shelter. But at my age, the digging would kill me before any storm could." Thomas was 13 when he first suggested he could do the digging. Jacob laughed, not unkindly. "You're strong for your age, but you don't understand what you're proposing. Moving that much earth, shoring up the cabin while you work underneath it, that's engineering. That's dangerous. One mistake and the whole cabin comes down on your head." But Jacob also began teaching Thomas the principles. On winter evenings, he sketched plans on paper. He explained load-bearing structures, how weight distributed through a building, where the stress concentrated. He taught Thomas about the water table, about drainage, about ventilation. He showed the boy how to identify solid stone suitable for wall building versus fractured stone that would fail under pressure. He explained why you never dug straight down without considering what held up the structure above. "If you're going to dig," Jacob said during one of these lessons, "you dig out from the existing cellar, not down. You shore up the cabin foundation as you go. You use timber supports, real railroad ties if you can get them. You build stone walls that interlock, not stack. Every piece supports every other piece, and you never, ever remove earth faster than you can replace it with structure." Thomas absorbed everything. He filled 3 notebooks with sketches and calculations and his grandfather's instructions. Jacob probably thought it was just a boy's idle interest, something Thomas would forget once he got older and discovered girls or cars or whatever typically captured teenage attention. Then Jacob died, and Thomas found himself alone in the cabin with notebooks full of plans and an obsession that had nowhere to go except down into the earth. Thomas started in early August of 1989, 3 weeks after burying his grandfather on the hillside overlooking the creek. The county had wanted to take him into foster care. He was 15 years old, legally too young to live alone. But the cabin was paid for. Jacob had left $17,000 in a bank account, and the nearest social worker was overwhelmed with 32 other cases. They gave him a provisional arrangement: check-ins every 2 weeks, proof of school enrollment when September came, and periodic home visits. Thomas agreed to everything and was left alone. He spent the first week doing nothing but sitting in the cabin, processing the silence. Jacob had not been a talkative man, but his presence had filled the space. Now the cabin felt enormous and empty, despite being only 24 feet by 30 feet of living area. Thomas slept poorly, woke early, and spent the days reading and rereading his grandfather's instructions about cellar expansion. By the second week, he was measuring. The existing cellar sat beneath the northwest corner of the cabin. Thomas's plan was to expand it eastward, creating an L-shaped underground space. The new section would measure 12 feet by 20 feet, extending 8 feet deep into the earth. Combined with the original cellar, the total underground area would be approximately 274 square feet, enough space to store extensive supplies, enough space to live in if necessary. The engineering challenge was significant. The cabin sat on a foundation of stacked fieldstone that extended roughly 18 inches below ground level. The floor joists above the existing cellar were supported by the cellar's stone walls. To expand eastward, Thomas would need to dig beneath the existing cabin floor while ensuring that floor remained supported throughout the excavation. He would need to install permanent support structures strong enough to carry the weight of the cabin indefinitely. Jacob's notes emphasized the danger. The cabin weighed approximately 14,000 pounds, accounting for logs, roof, furniture, and the wood stove. That weight pressed down on floor joists that rested on the foundation walls. Removing earth from beneath those joists without proper support would allow them to sag or crack, potentially causing catastrophic structural failure. Thomas's solution came from a sketch in Jacob's third notebook, a design the old man had drawn but never implemented. The concept involved creating a grid of support posts beneath the cabin before excavating the earth around them. The post would be railroad ties, 8 inches by 8 inches by 8 feet long, sunk vertically into the undisturbed earth below the planned cellar depth. Once the posts were in place, Thomas could excavate the soil around them, and the cabin's weight would transfer through the floor joists to the posts to the bedrock beneath. The design was sound in theory. The challenge would be implementation. Thomas was one person working alone with hand tools. What he was proposing would take months. The neighbors who occasionally checked on him would think he had lost his mind. He started digging on August 14th. The railroad ties arrived in September. Thomas had located them through a salvage yard in Billings, 63 miles east. The yard was selling off materials from a decommissioned rail spur that had serviced a copper mine closed since 1972. The ties were old-growth Douglas fir, treated with creosote, each one weighing approximately 200 pounds. Thomas bought 12 of them for $8 each, nearly draining Jacob's account, and hired a man with a flatbed truck to deliver them for $45. The driver helped Thomas unload the ties near the cabin, looked at the pile of excavated earth that now stood 7 feet high and 20 feet across, and asked what the boy was building. Thomas said he was expanding the root cellar. The driver shook his head, took his money, and left without another word. Thomas watched the truck disappear down the access road and felt the weight of being completely alone with an enormous project he might not be capable of finishing. Each railroad tie needed to be cut to a specific length based on its position in the support grid. Thomas used a 2-man crosscut saw, working one end while imagining his grandfather working the other. The saw was designed for 2 people. Using it alone required bracing one end and pulling with enough force to draw the blade through 8-inch thick timber. A single cut took 45 minutes and left Thomas's arms shaking with fatigue. He cut the first post to 7 feet 6 inches, allowing 6 inches to rest on bedrock and 7 feet to extend upward to meet the cabin's floor joists. Installing it required digging a hole 4 feet deep at the planned position, lowering the 200-pound timber vertically into the hole, ensuring it stood perfectly plumb using a level Jacob had owned since 1953, and then backfilling around the base with rocks and tamped earth. The first post took 8 hours to install. Thomas worked through an entire September day, skipping meals, stopping only for water. When he finally climbed out of the excavation that evening, the post stood solid, perfectly vertical, its top end resting against the underside of a floor joist. He pressed his weight against it, trying to rock it. The timber didn't move. Over the next 3 weeks, Thomas installed 11 more posts. The work developed a rhythm. Cut the timber in the morning when he was fresh. Dig the post hole in the afternoon. Install and backfill in the evening. Each post took slightly less time than the previous one as his technique improved. By early October, he had a grid of 12 support posts arranged in 3 rows of 4, each one locked solidly into the earth, each one carrying a portion of the cabin's weight. The cabin floor no longer rested entirely on the original foundation walls. Now the weight distributed through the floor joist to the support post to the bedrock 8 feet below the surface. Thomas tested his work by jumping on the floor above the excavation site. No movement, no creaking. The structure held. He was ready to begin the actual excavation. Thomas designed the new floor hatch during the first week of October, working by lantern light in the evenings after finishing the day's excavation. The original cellar entrance in the northwest corner was adequate for its purpose, a simple hinged trapdoor that opened upward. But Thomas wanted something different for the expanded space. He wanted an entrance that would be invisible unless you knew where to look. The design came from a book Jacob owned, a carpentry manual published in 1937. One chapter covered hidden storage compartments and concealed doors. The principle was simple. Make the door section indistinguishable from the surrounding floor. Use a hidden hinge mechanism, and ensure the door could be opened easily from either side. Thomas adapted the design to his specific needs. He selected a floor section in the cabin's center, an area measuring 3 feet by 4 feet between 2 floor joists. This location was ideal because it sat above the midpoint of the expanded cellar, allowing easy access to the entire underground space. The existing floorboards in this section were tongue-and-groove pine, milled from trees Jacob had cut himself in 1946. The boards were 1 inch thick, 6 inches wide, and showed 43 years of wear. Thomas carefully removed 12 boards from the selected area, numbering each one to ensure he could replace them in exact order. He built a rectangular frame using 2 by 6-inch lumber, creating a structure that fit perfectly in the floor opening. The removed floorboards were then attached to this frame, maintaining their original spacing and orientation. When reinstalled, the framed section would look identical to the surrounding floor. The hinge mechanism was the crucial element. Standard door hinges would be visible from above, destroying the concealment. Thomas needed a hinge that operated along one edge of the floor section, but remained hidden beneath the floorboards. His solution came from studying piano hinges, continuous hinges that ran the entire length of a connection point. He ordered a 4-foot piano hinge from a hardware catalog, paying $11 for heavy-duty steel construction. The hinge arrived 3 weeks later. Thomas installed it along one edge of the floor opening, attaching one leaf to the cabin's floor joist and the other leaf to the underside of the removable floor frame. When installed correctly, the hinge was completely hidden beneath the edge of the floorboards. The floor section could lift upward like a lid, pivoting on the hidden hinge. The counterweight system came last. A 3 by 4 foot section of 1-inch pine, even without the frame, weighed approximately 45 pounds. Too heavy to lift easily, especially for someone emerging from below. Thomas installed a simple counterweight using a canvas bag filled with 30 pounds of sand, suspended on a rope that ran over a pulley mounted to a ceiling joist. The rope connected to the floor hatch through a small hole drilled near the hinged edge. With the counterweight in place, the hatch lifted with minimal effort. From above, the floor looked continuous and undisturbed. Only someone who knew the exact location and applied upward pressure to the correct edge would discover the entrance. The excavation was complete by mid-November. Thomas had removed 127 cubic yards of earth, one 5-gallon bucket at a time, over 14 weeks. The underground space measured 12 feet by 20 feet by 8 feet deep, with stone walls on 3 sides and the original cellar opening into the 4th side. The stone walls were Montana fieldstone, each rock weighing between 15 and 60 pounds, carefully selected for flat surfaces and irregular shapes that interlocked when stacked. Thomas had built the walls without mortar, using a technique Jacob called dry stack masonry. Each stone was positioned to bear weight on multiple contact points with the stones below it. The wall construction had taken 5 weeks, working from the bottom up, ensuring each course was level before adding the next. The finished walls were 18 inches thick at the base, tapering to 12 inches at the top where they met the cabin floor. They were solid enough to lean against without any give, strong enough to support the cabin indefinitely. The ceiling was the cabin's original floor joists, now supported by the railroad tie posts at regular intervals. Thomas left the joists exposed rather than covering them with planks. The rough wood overhead gave the space a cave-like quality, primitive but functional. He installed 4 kerosene lanterns at strategic positions, hanging from hooks screwed into the joists. The lanterns provided adequate light and, as a bonus, added a small amount of heat. Heat was the critical consideration. At 8 feet below the surface, the Earth maintained a temperature of approximately 53 degrees year-round, warmed by geothermal energy rising from the planet's core. This was survivable, but not comfortable for extended periods. Thomas installed a small wood stove in the northwest corner, using the existing chimney from the cabin above. The stove was a box heater that had belonged to Jacob's father, built in 1923, designed to burn wood slowly and efficiently. The stove's chimney pipe connected to the main cabin chimney through a careful junction Thomas welded together using borrowed equipment. The arrangement allowed smoke to vent properly while ensuring the underground stove didn't interfere with the cabin stove above. On cold days, Thomas tested the system and found the small stove could raise the underground temperature to 68 degrees with minimal wood consumption. Water was his next priority. The water table sat at 11 feet below the surface, 3 feet below the cellar floor. Thomas hand-dug a narrow shaft in the northeast corner, going down through clay and gravel until water began seeping in. He installed a 4-inch diameter pipe in the shaft, creating a well. A simple hand pump mounted at floor level could draw water up through the pipe. The system provided unlimited fresh water without requiring any connection to the surface. For storage, Thomas built shelves along the east wall using lumber from dismantled shipping pallets he had collected from the Garnet Ridge feed store. The shelves held 47 quarts of vegetables Jacob had canned before his death, 32 pounds of dried beans, 18 pounds of rice, 12 pounds of flour, and various other staples. The first real snow came on November 23rd, a modest 4 inches that melted within 2 days. Thomas was in town buying kerosene when Harold Jensen, who owned the hardware store, asked about the construction project. Word had spread about the strange boy living alone in the old Harwell cabin, digging in the ground, buying railroad ties and hardware, keeping to himself. Small towns notice everything. Thomas explained he had expanded the root cellar into a proper storm shelter. Harold nodded slowly, the way adults do when they think a child is saying something foolish but don't want to be unkind. Storm shelter, Harold repeated. Like for tornadoes? Thomas shook his head. For winter storms, blizzards like the one in '49. Harold's expression shifted from polite interest to concern. Son, that storm was once in a lifetime. We're not going to see another like that. You're spending a lot of time and money on something you'll probably never need. Thomas paid for the kerosene and left. He understood Harold's perspective. The blizzard of '49 was 41 years past. An entire generation had grown up without experiencing anything comparable. To people who hadn't lived through it, Jacob's stories probably sounded like exaggeration, the way old people always claimed things were worse in their day. But the mockery grew more direct when Thomas tried to share what he had built. In early February of 1990, during a community meeting at the Garnet Ridge School, Thomas approached Sheriff Martin Kendrick and explained that he had a shelter capable of housing multiple people in emergency situations. The cabin was 5 miles north of town on a relatively main road. If severe weather struck, people should know the shelter existed. Sheriff Kendrick listened patiently, then smiled. That's real thoughtful of you, Thomas, but we've got emergency protocols. We've got the school gym, the church basement. If weather gets bad, we know what to do. But if people get stranded, Thomas pressed, if they're on the highway and can't make it to town, then they stay with their vehicles and wait for rescue. The sheriff's tone was kind but firm. That's the protocol. What you've built sounds impressive, but emergency response can't rely on one kid's basement project. You understand that, right? Thomas understood. He also understood that the sheriff thought he was wasting his time on a paranoid fantasy inherited from an old man who had lived alone too long. The worst came from his classmates at Garnet Ridge High School. Thomas attended irregularly, showing up for exams and required classes, but otherwise studying at home. When he was there, students whispered about the bunker boy who was preparing for the apocalypse. Someone started a rumor that Thomas believed the world was ending. Someone else claimed he was building a bomb shelter because he thought the Russians were coming. Thomas stopped trying to explain. He finished provisioning the shelter through February and early March, and he waited. The weather turned strange on February 28th. Thomas woke to a temperature of 47 degrees, unseasonably warm for late winter in Montana. The snow that had accumulated through January and February was melting rapidly, creating streams of runoff that carved channels through the remaining drifts. By noon, the temperature reached 53 degrees. The sky was overcast but not threatening. It felt like an early spring. The radio told a different story. Thomas listened to the NOAA weather broadcast every morning, a habit Jacob had taught him. The meteorologist's voice carried an unusual tension. A massive low-pressure system was developing over Alberta, Canada, drawing Arctic air southward. The system was expected to collide with warm, moist air pushing up from the Gulf of Mexico. The conditions were aligning for a significant winter storm, possibly a blizzard, to strike the northern Rockies within 48 to 72 hours. Thomas checked his barometer, an aneroid instrument Jacob had mounted on the cabin wall in 1955. The needle pointed to 29.1 inches of mercury and dropping. Normal atmospheric pressure was approximately 29.9 inches. A rapid drop indicated a strong storm system approaching. Thomas tapped the barometer's glass, and the needle dropped further to 29.0. On March 1st, the temperature held steady at 45 degrees through the morning, then began falling rapidly after noon. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, it was 38 degrees. By 6 o'clock, 27 degrees. By 9 o'clock, 18 degrees. The drop was dramatic and continuous, nearly 30 degrees in 9 hours. The wind picked up, shifting from southwest to northwest, bringing the smell of cold air and snow. Thomas spent March 1st checking his shelter systems one final time. He descended through the floor hatch and methodically inspected everything. The water pump functioned properly, drawing clear water from the well. The wood stove's chimney drew smoke efficiently with no backdraft. The ventilation system, consisting of a small intake pipe near the floor and an exhaust connection through the chimney, provided adequate fresh air circulation. The lanterns had full reservoirs of kerosene. The shelves held sufficient food for one person for 6 months, or multiple people for a shorter duration. He tested the counterweight system on the floor hatch, opening and closing it a dozen times to ensure smooth operation. He verified that the hatch could be opened from below by pushing upward on a specific board. He checked the concealment from above, confirming that the floor looked completely natural, with no visible seam or indication of the entrance. That evening, Thomas heard the updated forecast. The storm system had intensified faster than predicted. Blizzard warnings were now in effect for all of northern Montana beginning the morning of March 2nd. Expected snowfall, 1 to 2 feet. Expected wind speeds, sustained 40 to 60 miles per hour with gusts to 85. Expected duration, 24 to 48 hours. Travel would be impossible. Power outages were likely. Temperatures would plummet to negative 20 degrees or below. Thomas banked the cabin's wood stove, laid out his heaviest winter clothing, and tried to sleep. Thomas woke at 6:30 on the morning of March 2nd to absolute silence. The kind of silence that precedes violence. He dressed quickly and stepped outside into air that burned his lungs with cold. The temperature had dropped to 12 degrees overnight. The sky was a uniform gray, low clouds pressing down like a ceiling. No wind yet, but the stillness felt temporary, a held breath before the exhalation. By 9 o'clock, the first flakes began falling. Large, heavy flakes that accumulated quickly on the ground. Within 20 minutes, a white layer covered the dirt and dead grass around the cabin. The wind arrived at 9:43, a sudden gust that shook the cabin's walls and sent a cascade of snow off the roof. Then the wind became constant, building from 15 miles per hour to 30, then to 45. At 11:27, the storm transformed from heavy snowfall to full blizzard. The wind jumped to 60 miles per hour in a matter of minutes. Visibility collapsed. Thomas stood at the cabin window and could no longer see the woodpile 15 feet from the door. The world became white chaos, snow driving horizontally, the wind's roar drowning out all other sound. He checked the thermometer mounted outside the window. 18 degrees and dropping. The radio crackled with emergency broadcasts. Highway 12 was closed. All roads in the county were impassable. Residents were advised to shelter in place. Do not attempt travel. Do not leave your homes. The storm was intensifying beyond predictions. Wind gusts were now reaching 85 miles per hour. Snowfall rates exceeded 3 inches per hour in some areas. Thomas added wood to the stove and watched the storm through the window. The cabin shuddered with each gust. Snow found its way through microscopic gaps around the window frames, creating small drifts on the interior sills. The temperature inside the cabin was holding at 58 degrees, but he could feel cold air seeping in around the door, through the walls, rising up from the floor despite the shelter's warmth beneath. At 12:15, he heard something unusual through the storm's roar. An engine. Diesel, heavy, struggling. The sound grew louder, closer, then stopped. Thomas pulled on his coat and opened the door against the wind's resistance. The cold struck him like a physical blow. Snow immediately plastered his face. He could see nothing beyond 5 feet. The engine sound came again, revving high, then grinding to a halt. Someone was out there in the storm, close to the cabin. Thomas retreated inside and found his heaviest rope, a 100-foot length of 3/4-inch hemp that Jacob had used for hauling firewood. He tied one end to the porch railing, wound the rope around his waist, and stepped back into the blizzard. The wind tried to push him off his feet. The snow was already 8 inches deep and accumulating fast. Thomas oriented himself toward where he thought the engine sound had come from, roughly southwest of the cabin, and began walking, feeding rope out behind him as he went. 5 steps and the cabin disappeared behind him. 10 steps and he had no sense of direction except the rope leading back. 15 steps and he stumbled into something large and yellow. A school bus. Thomas's gloved hand touched the bus's side mirror first, then slid along the cold metal until he found the door. He pounded on it with his fist. The door hissed open, operated manually by someone inside, and warm air rushed out to meet the storm. Thomas pulled himself up the steps and into a scene of controlled fear. 14 children, ranging from 6 to 13 years old, sat in the seats. 2 teachers, women Thomas recognized from seeing them in town, stood in the aisle. The bus driver, a man named Carl Morton, who was perhaps 50 years old, sat behind the wheel with his hands still gripping it, though the engine was now silent. Everyone turned to look at Thomas as he stood dripping snow in the doorway. "Thank God," Carl said. "I saw your cabin lights. Couldn't see anything else. Made it maybe 300 yards off the highway before the snow got too deep. Bus is stuck. Couldn't go forward, couldn't back up, couldn't see to try. We've been sitting here for 20 minutes debating what to do." Thomas looked at the children. Most wore winter coats, but not the heavy parkas needed for sustained exposure to blizzard conditions. Some of the younger ones were crying quietly. The older students looked scared but were trying to hide it. The bus's interior temperature was probably 65 degrees now, but would drop rapidly with the engine off. "How much fuel do you have?" Thomas asked. Carl checked the gauge. "1/4 tank. Maybe enough to run the heater for 3 or 4 hours if we're conservative. After that..." He didn't finish the sentence. Everyone understood what happened when the heat ran out in -20-degree temperatures. One of the teachers, a woman named Patricia Chin, who taught 4th grade, stepped forward. "We were heading back from a field trip to the museum in Helena. Left late because of the weather forecast, thought we could make it back before the storm hit. Radio said it wasn't supposed to start until afternoon." Her voice carried the weight of a decision that had gone terribly wrong. Thomas did quick calculations. The cabin was approximately 380 yards away. That distance through the blizzard with children would be nearly impossible. Even tethered to his rope, guiding 14 kids through zero visibility and wind that could knock adults off their feet seemed likely to result in someone getting separated, getting lost, freezing. But staying with the bus meant freezing more slowly as the fuel ran out and the interior temperature dropped to match the exterior. "My cabin has heat and shelter," Thomas said, "but I don't know if we can get everyone there safely in these conditions." "We can't stay here," Carl said quietly. Radio says this storm is going to last through tomorrow, maybe longer. We'll freeze long before it's over. The second teacher, Mary Sullivan, who taught second grade, spoke up. How far is your cabin? 400 yards, maybe less. I have a rope tied to my porch. If we all hold on to it, we can follow it back. With children? Patricia's voice rose. Some of these kids weigh 60 pounds. The wind will blow them away. Thomas looked at the 14 faces watching him. The youngest was a girl named Emma Pritchard, 6 years old, maybe 55 pounds. The oldest was Daniel Voss, 13, probably 110 pounds. None of them would survive if the bus's heat failed. Some of them might not survive the journey to the cabin. But staying guaranteed freezing. Moving gave them a chance. We rope everyone together, Thomas said. Single file. Adults in front, middle, and back. Everyone holds the rope with both hands. Nobody lets go. We move slow. If someone falls, we stop until they're back up. 400 yards. 10 minutes if we're careful. Carl stood up. I'll take the lead position. You guide since you know the way. Thomas shook his head. I need to be at the front because I'm the only one who knows exactly where the cabin is. You take the rear. Make sure nobody falls behind. He turned to Patricia and Mary. You two in the middle, between groups of kids. If anyone starts to freeze or panic, you handle it. They organized quickly. Thomas took rope from his emergency kit in the cabin and created a secondary line, tying loops every 6 feet. Each person would hold a loop, creating a connected chain. The children were positioned with older kids responsible for watching younger ones. Emma Pritchard, the smallest, was paired with Daniel Voss, the largest. Patricia Chen positioned herself 1/3 of the way back. Mary Sullivan took the 2/3 position. Carl Morton anchored the rear. Before they left, Thomas had everyone wrap scarves around their faces, leaving only eyes exposed. He checked every coat to ensure it was zipped or buttoned fully. He explained the rules. Both hands on the rope at all times. Eyes on the person in front of you. If you fall, yell immediately. If you see someone fall, yell immediately. Do not let go of the rope for any reason. What if someone does let go? A boy named Michael asked. Then they die, Thomas said flatly. Patricia started to object to his bluntness, but Thomas continued. That's not meant to scare you. That's the truth. In this storm, if you're not connected to this rope, you're lost. Visibility is 0. You can't see 5 feet. The cold will kill you in minutes. So you hold on. Understand? 14 heads nodded. They left the bus at 1:17 in the afternoon. The moment they stepped outside, the wind nearly tore them apart. Thomas felt the rope go taut behind him as people struggled to stay upright. He waited until everyone signaled they were ready, then began moving forward, following his original rope back toward the cabin. The journey should have taken 10 minutes. It took 26. The wind fought them. The snow blinded them. Twice, children fell, and the entire line had to stop while they were helped to their feet. Once, the wind everyone accounted for. No one lost. Inside, they crowded into the cabin's single room, dripping melting snow onto the floor. The wood stove struggled to heat the space with the door opening and closing. Thomas added more wood, but he understood the physics. The cabin was 24 feet by 30 feet, roughly 720 square feet. 17 people generated substantial body heat, but they also consumed oxygen, crowded the limited space, and would need food and water the cabin's normal stores couldn't adequately provide. The temperature inside was 54 degrees and dropping as cold air flooded in each time someone moved near the poorly insulated walls. Patricia Chen pulled off her coat and immediately put it back on. It's not much warmer in here than outside. The stove will catch up, Thomas said, though he knew it wouldn't. Not with this many people, and a storm that was dropping the exterior temperature toward -20. The children huddled together near the stove. Mary Sullivan organized them into sitting positions, older kids on the outside, younger ones in the middle. Carl Morton checked the windows, noting how frost was forming on the interior glass despite the stove burning. "We've got maybe 6 hours before this place gets dangerous," he said quietly to Thomas. "Maybe less if the storm gets worse." Thomas had been doing his own calculations. The cabin would cool despite the stove's efforts. The wood supply outside was inaccessible now, buried under rapidly accumulating snow. The stack inside would last perhaps 12 hours if they burned it steadily. After that, they would be relying on body heat alone, and 17 people huddled in a freezing cabin would eventually succumb to hypothermia, unless they went down. Thomas walked to the center of the cabin, to the place where the floor looked like every other section of floor. He knelt down and pressed his fingers against one specific board, applying upward pressure. The counterweight engaged, and the 3-by-4-foot section lifted smoothly on its hidden hinge. Warm air rose from the opening below, carrying the scent of earth and stone and burning wood. Everyone stopped talking and stared. "There's a shelter under the cabin," Thomas said simply. 8 feet down, stone walls. Heat from the earth keeps it at 55 degrees without any stove. With a stove, it's warmer. There's room for all of us. There's food and water. We can stay down there until the storm ends. Patricia approached the opening and looked down. Lantern light showed stone walls and wooden shelves, and a space that seemed impossible. "How long have you been building this?" "Since August. 18 months of work." Carl knelt beside the opening. "This is what you tried to tell Sheriff Kendrick about?" "Yes." "The shelter nobody believed you needed?" Thomas nodded. The descent took 40 minutes. Thomas went first, climbing down the wooden ladder he had built into the stone wall, demonstrating that the structure was safe. Then he guided the children down, one at a time, with Patricia and Mary positioned at the top of the opening to steady each child as they started the climb. The younger ones were frightened by the darkness and the depth, but the alternative was staying in a cabin that was growing colder by the minute. Emma Pritchard, the 6-year-old, cried when it was her turn. Mary knelt beside her and explained that it was like climbing down into a basement, just a little deeper than normal. Thomas called up from below that he would catch her if she slipped, that the ladder was strong, that there was warm light and space to sit at the bottom. Emma finally agreed, and Daniel Voss, the 13-year-old who had been paired with her during the walk from the bus, climbed down beside her, talking to her the entire way, telling her where to put her feet. By 2:30 in the afternoon, all 17 people stood in the underground shelter. The space that had seemed enormous when Thomas worked alone now felt crowded, but not dangerously so. The children spread out along the walls, sitting on the stone floor that had been swept clean. The adults remained standing, taking in the scope of what Thomas had built. The shelter measured 12 feet by 20 feet, with an 8-foot ceiling created by the cabin's floor joists overhead. Stone walls on 3 sides, each 18 inches thick at the base, rose from the packed earth floor to meet the wooden ceiling. The 4th side opened into the original root cellar, a smaller space that Thomas had left intact for storage. Railroad tie posts stood at regular intervals, supporting the cabin's weight, each post showing the careful workmanship of someone who understood that lives might depend on this structure holding. The temperature was 58 degrees, warm enough that people began removing their heavy coats. The small wood stove in the corner radiated heat, its chimney connecting to the main cabin chimney above. Thomas added wood to the stove, and the temperature climbed slowly towards 65 degrees. The children stopped shivering. Color returned to faces that had been pale with cold. Patricia Chen walked the perimeter, examining the stone walls, the support posts, the ventilation pipes, the well with its hand pump. "This is professional-level construction," she said. This isn't something a teenager builds alone. My grandfather taught me, Thomas said. He survived the blizzard of '49 because he had a cellar to shelter in. He always said the ground doesn't freeze if you go deep enough. Heat from the Earth's core. That's constant. Carl Morton tested the hand pump and watched clear water flow into a wooden bucket. You have running water down here. Water table is 11 feet down. The well shaft goes through the cellar floor. Pump brings it up. Thomas demonstrated, working the pump handle until water splashed into the bucket. Enough for all of us. Unlimited supply. Mary Sullivan was examining the shelves that lined the east wall. Jars of canned vegetables, bags of dried beans and rice, flour, salt, sugar, coffee, tea, dried meat wrapped in cloth. How long could we survive down here? Thomas did quick calculations. For one person, 6 months easily. For 17 people, maybe 2 weeks if we're careful with portions. But the storm won't last that long. Radio said 24 to 48 hours. We have enough for 3 days, maybe 4. The first night underground was difficult. The space was warm and safe, but the psychological weight of being 8 feet beneath the earth pressed on everyone. The children asked repeatedly when they could go back up. Thomas explained that the storm was still raging, that the cabin above was now colder than the shelter, that they needed to wait until the wind stopped and the temperature rose. He organized sleeping arrangements. The children lay on the floor in rows, using their coats as pillows and blankets. The adults took turns staying awake, keeping the stove fed, monitoring the lanterns, listening to the muffled roar of the wind above. Thomas showed Patricia how to work the ventilation system, explaining that the intake pipe near the floor brought fresh air down from outside, while the exhaust through the chimney carried stale air up. The system was passive, requiring no pumps or fans, relying on temperature differences to create circulation. By midnight on March 2nd, the temperature outside had dropped to negative 18 degrees. The wind sustained at 63 miles per hour, with gusts recorded at 91 by weather stations still operating. Snow accumulation reached 14 inches and continued at 2 to 3 inches per hour. Highway 12 was buried under drifts measuring 6 to 8 feet. The school bus where they had been stranded was now completely covered, invisible beneath white. Inside the shelter, the temperature held steady at 66 degrees. The children slept fitfully, but safely. The adults talked quietly about how close they had come to disaster, how a field trip that should have been routine had nearly killed 17 people, how a teenage boy's obsession with survival had saved them all. March 3rd brought no improvement. The storm continued through the day and into the night. Thomas rationed food carefully, serving small portions of beans and rice cooked on the wood stove, supplemented with canned vegetables. Water was unlimited from the well. The children adapted to their underground existence, playing quiet games, telling stories, sleeping when exhaustion overcame the strangeness of their situation. The adults took turns climbing the ladder to check conditions above. Each time, they returned with the same report. The storm continued. The cabin was filled with snow that had blown in through gaps around the door and windows. The interior temperature was below freezing. Staying underground remained the only viable option. On March 4th, the wind finally began to diminish. By evening, the sustained speed dropped below 40 miles per hour for the first time in 54 hours. The snow continued, but less heavily. The temperature outside remained at negative 12 degrees, but the worst of the storm was passing. Thomas allowed himself to believe they would survive. On the morning of March 5th, Carl Morton asked the question that had been building in everyone's minds. How does this actually work? Not just that you built it, but the physics of why we're warm down here when it's negative 20 above. Thomas was checking the water supply, working the hand pump to refill the bucket they used for drinking water. He stopped and looked at the adults gathered around him. The children were occupied on the far side of the shelter, playing a game Daniel Voss had invented using stones from the cellar floor. This was a moment for explanation, for education, for helping people understand what had saved their lives. "The Earth maintains a constant temperature below the frost line," Thomas began. "In Montana, the frost line is about 5 feet deep. Below that depth, seasonal temperature changes don't penetrate. The ground temperature matches the average annual air temperature, which in this region is approximately 48 to 55 degrees. He gestured to the stone walls around them. "We're 8 feet down. At this depth, the Earth is 53 degrees year-round. Winter, summer, doesn't matter. The planet's geothermal heat keeps it constant. These stone walls are in direct contact with that Earth. They absorb the heat and radiate it into this space." Patricia Chen touched the stone wall near her. "It feels cool, not warm." "It's cooler than your hand, which is 98 degrees, but it's warmer than the air outside, which is -20. The stone is 55 degrees. That's 75 degrees warmer than the exterior temperature. That difference is what keeps us alive." Mary Sullivan was examining the ceiling joists overhead. "But we're directly under the cabin. Doesn't the cold from above affect this space?" "It would if the cabin floor was in direct contact with the shelter ceiling," Thomas explained. "But it's not. There's an air gap between the floor joists. That gap provides insulation. Cold air is denser than warm air, so the cold stays up in the cabin while warm air stays down here. The separation creates a thermal barrier." He pointed to the railroad tie posts supporting the structure. "These posts transfer the cabin's weight directly to the bedrock below. They're structural, not thermal. They don't conduct significant heat in either direction because wood is a poor thermal conductor. The stone walls, on the other hand, are excellent thermal mass. They hold heat and release it slowly." Carl was studying the ventilation system. 2 pipes ran up through the ceiling, one near the floor level of the shelter and one near the ceiling level. "Explain the air circulation. We've got 17 people breathing down here. How are we not running out of oxygen?" Thomas walked to the intake pipe near the floor. "This pipe draws fresh air from outside. It's a 4-inch diameter pipe that extends up through the cabin floor and out through the roof. Fresh air comes down because of pressure differences. The air outside is cold and dense, so it sinks down into this warmer space." He moved to the exhaust pipe near the ceiling. "This pipe connects to the cabin's main chimney. The stove creates a draft that pulls air up. As warm air rises and exits through this pipe, it creates negative pressure that draws fresh air down through the intake pipe. The system is passive. No fans, no electricity, just physics." Patricia was taking notes on a small pad she had in her coat pocket. "What about carbon monoxide from the stove?" "The stove's chimney is completely separate from the living space. It vents directly up and out. The combustion gases never enter this room. The only air we breathe is fresh air from outside that's been warmed by passing through the earth and by the stove's radiant heat." Thomas demonstrated by holding his hand near the stove. "The stove isn't necessary for survival, just for comfort. The Earth's heat alone keeps this space above freezing. The stove adds luxury, raising the temperature from 55 to 65 degrees." Mary looked at the well shaft in the corner. "And the water? How does that work?" "The water table in this area is 11 feet below surface level. I dug through the shelter floor down to that depth and installed a pipe. The pipe prevents the shaft from collapsing while allowing water to seep in from the surrounding aquifer. The hand pump creates suction that draws water up 3 feet from the water table to our floor level." He worked the pump handle to demonstrate. Clear, cold water flowed into the bucket. "This is groundwater, naturally filtered through layers of soil and rock. It's safe to drink without treatment. The aquifer is constantly recharged by rain and snowmelt, so we'll never run out. Even with 17 people, we couldn't drain it. Carl knelt by the well shaft and looked down into darkness. You designed all of this yourself? A 15-year-old kid figured out geothermal heating, passive ventilation, and groundwater access? My grandfather figured most of it out, Thomas said quietly. He spent years thinking about how to survive in this environment. He drew plans, made calculations, studied other people's shelters and why they failed. He just never had the time or energy to build it himself. I followed his plans. I just did the work. Patricia closed her notebook. This isn't a shelter. This is engineering. This is the kind of system that should be documented, taught, replicated. You've created something that could save lives across the entire Northern Plains. Thomas shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. It kept us alive. That's what matters. But even as he said it, he understood that what he had built was more than a personal survival tool. It was a solution to a problem that would face others, a design that could be adapted and improved, a legacy that might extend far beyond this single storm and these 17 people. The wind stopped at 3:47 on the morning of March 5th. Thomas was awake, tending the stove, when he noticed the change. The constant roar that had been the soundtrack of their underground existence for 72 hours simply ceased. The silence was profound, almost disturbing after so long with the storm's voice overhead. He climbed the ladder and pushed open the floor hatch. Cold air poured down into the shelter, shocking after 3 days of relative warmth. Thomas pulled himself up into the cabin and stood in darkness. The windows were completely blocked by snow. He couldn't see anything until he lit a lantern from the shelf where he kept emergency supplies. The interior of the cabin looked like a cave. Snow had forced its way through every gap around the door and windows, creating drifts that reached 3 feet high in some places. The wood stove was buried. The table and chairs were covered. Frost coated every surface. The temperature inside was approximately 15 degrees, barely warmer than outside. If they had tried to shelter here, they would have frozen. Thomas moved to the door and tried to open it. It wouldn't budge. Snow had accumulated against the exterior, creating pressure that held the door closed. He pushed harder, throwing his shoulder against the wood, and felt the door move slightly. He pushed again and again, gradually forcing an opening. Snow cascaded through the gap, spilling onto the cabin floor. When the opening was wide enough, Thomas squeezed through and stepped outside into a transformed world. The storm had deposited 9 feet of snow across the landscape, with drifts measuring 20 feet or more where the wind had sculpted them. The school bus was completely buried, nothing visible but a slight mound in the snow that might have been anything. The woodpile near the cabin was gone, hidden beneath white. Even the porch railing where Thomas had tied his rope was barely visible, just the top few inches protruding above the snow surface. The sky was clear. Stars burned overhead with the intensity they only achieved in extreme cold. The temperature was -8 degrees according to the thermometer, cold but survivable. Most importantly, the air was still. No wind. The storm had exhausted itself. Thomas returned to the shelter and reported what he had seen. The adults discussed their options. The highway was certainly impassable. The town 12 miles away might as well be 1,200 miles. But the storm was over, and eventually rescue would come. Snowplows would clear the roads. Searchers would look for the missing school bus. They needed to make themselves visible and wait. They emerged slowly, climbing up through the floor hatch one at a time, entering the frozen cabin. The children were excited to see daylight again, even filtered through snow-blocked windows. Thomas and Carl worked together to fully open the cabin door, shoveling snow with pieces of wood since actual shovels were buried outside. When the door was clear, they stepped out onto the porch and looked at the devastation. "How long until someone finds us?" Mary asked. "Depends on when they start searching," Carl said. "The school will have reported us missing as soon as the storm started. They know we were on Highway 12 heading west. Searchers will follow that route looking for the bus. Could be today, could be tomorrow." Thomas had a better idea. He retrieved a red blanket from the cabin's storage, climbed onto the roof using a ladder of packed snow he created by trampling a path, and spread the blanket across the white surface. The red fabric was visible for miles against the snow. He also fashioned a flag from a sheet and a long pole, raising it as high as he could manage, creating a signal that anyone searching from the air would see immediately. They spent the day of March 5th waiting. The children played in the snow, building structures and throwing snowballs, burning off energy after 3 days of confinement. The adults took turns watching the road, looking for any sign of rescue vehicles. Thomas kept the cabin stove burning now that they could access the buried woodpile through excavation. The shelter below remained available if they needed to retreat to warmth, but with the storm past, staying in the cabin was bearable. The helicopter appeared at 2:15 in the afternoon. Thomas heard it before he saw it, the distinctive thump of rotor blades cutting through cold air. He ran outside and waved the red blanket over his head. The helicopter circled once, descended low enough to confirm people were present and alive, then climbed and headed back toward town. Rescue vehicles arrived 3 hours later. Snowplows had been working since dawn, clearing Highway 12 one slow mile at a time. Sheriff Martin Kendrick led the rescue party, arriving in a tracked vehicle capable of navigating the deep snow. Behind him came an ambulance, also equipped with tracks, and several volunteers on snowmobiles. The reunion was emotional. Parents had been gathered in town for 3 days, not knowing if their children were alive or dead. Radio communication had been impossible during the storm. The school bus had vanished into the blizzard with 14 children and 3 adults. Now they were all safe, all healthy, saved by a shelter that nobody had believed necessary. Sheriff Kendrick stood in Thomas's cabin, looking at the open floor hatch and the warm glow from below. "You tried to tell me about this." "Yes, sir." "I didn't listen." "No, sir." The sheriff climbed down into the shelter and spent 10 minutes examining the construction. When he emerged, his face showed something between admiration and shame. "This saved 17 lives." "Yes, sir." "Because you listened to your grandfather and I didn't listen to you." Thomas didn't respond. There was nothing to say that wouldn't sound like accusation or vindication, and he felt neither. He had built what needed to be built. It had worked. That was sufficient. The story of Thomas Harwell's shelter spread through Montana with the speed that only genuine survival stories achieve. Local newspapers ran features. Regional television stations sent reporters. The Billings Gazette published a detailed article with photographs of the underground space and diagrams Thomas drew explaining the construction principles. Within 2 weeks, Thomas received 47 letters from people asking for plans, advice, or permission to replicate his design. The shelter became a minor tourist attraction that spring. People drove out to the cabin asking to see the space that had saved 17 lives. Thomas accommodated them when he could, giving tours, explaining the engineering, answering technical questions. He wasn't comfortable with the attention, but he understood that what he had built had value beyond his personal survival. If others could learn from his work, if other lives could be saved, then sharing the knowledge was an obligation. By summer of 1990, 3 families within 50 miles of Garnet Ridge had begun construction on similar shelters. They modified Thomas's design based on their specific circumstances, some going deeper, some using concrete instead of stone, some incorporating electrical systems and ventilation fans, but the core principles remained the same. Go below the frost line. Use the Earth's constant temperature. Create thermal mass with stone or concrete. Ensure proper ventilation. Access groundwater if possible. Thomas graduated from Garnet Ridge High School in May of 1991, ranked third in his class of 47 students. He had been accepted to Montana State University to study civil engineering with a focus on structural design. The university had offered him a partial scholarship after learning about his shelter project. A local construction company offered to hire him for summer work, specifically to help them develop emergency shelter designs for rural clients. Before leaving for college, Thomas spent a week documenting his shelter in detail. He measured every dimension, photographed every component, wrote step-by-step construction notes, and calculated material costs and labor hours. The documentation filled 73 pages and included hand-drawn diagrams that showed support beam placement, stone wall construction techniques, ventilation routing, and well shaft installation. He made 20 copies and distributed them to anyone who asked. The shelter itself remained functional and maintained. Thomas arranged for a neighbor, an older man named Pete Davidson who lived 4 miles south, to check on the cabin monthly. Pete had been one of the first people to tour the shelter after the rescue, and he understood its value. He kept the access clear, tested the water pump quarterly, and ensured the structure remained sound. Thomas returned during college breaks and maintained the space himself, replacing worn components, upgrading the stove, improving the ventilation system based on what he learned in his engineering classes. Over the following years, Thomas's design influenced emergency shelter construction across the Northern Plains. By 1995, an estimated 40 to 60 similar shelters existed in Montana, Wyoming, and North Dakota. Some were private family shelters like Thomas's. Others were community shelters built by towns or counties for use during severe weather emergencies. A school district near Great Falls constructed a shelter beneath their elementary school gymnasium, capable of housing 200 people, using principles directly adapted from Thomas's design. The blizzard of 1990 remained the worst winter storm to strike Montana since the legendary blizzard of 1949. 9 people died during the storm, most from vehicle accidents or exposure when caught outside. But 17 people survived, specifically because of Thomas Harwell's shelter. That number was documented, confirmed, and became part of the storm's official record. Thomas graduated from Montana State in 1995 with a degree in civil engineering. He was hired by a Bozeman firm specializing in rural construction and infrastructure. His specific expertise was emergency shelter design and retrofit, helping homeowners and communities create spaces that could sustain life during severe weather. He consulted on 43 shelter projects over the following 10 years, refining the design, adapting it to different soil conditions and climate zones, teaching others the principles his grandfather had taught him. He married in 1998. His wife, Anna, was a teacher he met while consulting on a school shelter project. They built their own home in 2000, incorporating an underground shelter that went 12 feet deep and measured 16 by 24 feet. It featured all the innovations Thomas had developed over the years: concrete walls for superior thermal mass, a solar-powered ventilation system with battery backup, a deep well with electric and hand pump options, LED lighting, and a water filtration system. The shelter could sustain 8 people for 30 days, or 2 people for a year. Jacob Harwell's cabin still stands 5 miles north of Garnet Ridge. The structure is maintained by Thomas's family as a reminder and a resource. The shelter beneath remains functional, though it hasn't been needed for its original emergency purpose since 1990. Occasionally, Thomas brings engineering students there to study the design, to see what can be accomplished with basic materials and careful thought, to understand that survival often depends not on technology or luck, but on preparation and knowledge. The 14 children who sheltered underground during the blizzard of '90 are now adults with their own families. Several of them built shelters beneath their homes. Emma Pritchard, the 6-year-old who was afraid to climb down the ladder, became a structural engineer herself, specializing in disaster-resistant residential design. Daniel Voss, the 13-year-old who guided her down, works for FEMA, coordinating rural emergency preparedness programs. They remember the 72 hours underground. They remember the warmth when they should have been freezing. They remember the teenager who built something impossible and saved their lives through knowledge and effort, and the wisdom of a grandfather who survived his own blizzard and passed that survival forward to his grandson. The impossible had become routine. A shelter that could withstand Montana's worst weather wasn't fantasy. It was engineering. It was preparation. It was the understanding that the ground beneath your feet holds heat that no storm can take away, that water flows beneath the frost line regardless of surface conditions, that stone and earth and careful design can create safety when everything above ground fails. Thomas Harwell proved that survival isn't about hoping conditions improve. It's about building infrastructure that functions regardless of conditions, about learning from those who came before, about taking the time to do things properly even when nobody believes you need to. His shelter saved 17 lives in 1990. The principles behind that shelter have influenced hundreds of other projects and potentially saved dozens more lives in the decades since. The legacy continues, built into the earth, hidden beneath floors, waiting silently for the moment when the storm comes and people need shelter that can keep them alive. And when that moment comes, they descend through floor hatches into spaces that shouldn't exist but do, into warmth that shouldn't be possible but is, into safety created by knowledge passed down and effort invested, and the understanding that preparation, not luck, determines who survives.